If you're like me, you opened a pack of Ravnica Remastered and got a Niv-Mizzet Parun. Or maybe you bought the new Quick Draw Commander deck from Thunder Junction, saw this cute little guy, and went, hey, I can make a commander deck out of that. Well, whichever the case, this iteration of Niv-Mizzet is a very popular blue and red Spellslinger commander that can even be upgraded to be really competitive. But Magic is expensive, and I don't want to dish out thousands of dollars just to play some games with friends. That's where I come in. Hi, my name's Jared, welcome to MTG, and in this video we're going to look into building a budget commander deck around Niv-Mizzet Parun. Alright, so before we get to the actual list, let's go over how this video is going to work. First, I'm going to go over my list on a budget of $50. Then, I'll cover some upgrades and discuss some swaps to increase the budget from $50 to $100. Then finally, at the end of the video, I'll give you my top 10 budget list cards to put in the deck that I couldn't fit in the budget, but would really amplify the deck's power level. So, let's get started. Alright, let's first take a moment to get a good look at our commander. For 3 blue and 3 red mana, we get a 5/5 Dragon Wizard that can't be countered and flying. It also has, whenever you draw a card, it deals 1 damage to any target, and when any player, casts an instant or sorcery spell, you draw a card. Niv-Mizzet's 2 triggered abilities both feed off of each other. Drawing a card off of his second trigger will cause his first ability to trigger as well. These 2 abilities can cause some interesting interactions to happen, including the opportunity for combo potential, even in our $50 budget build. Curiosity is an enchantment aura that reads, whenever enchanted creature deals damage to an opponent, you may draw a card. So with Niv enchanted with Curiosity, simply drawing a card or having Niv deal damage to an opponent can start a loop where drawing a card triggers Niv, and Niv dealing damage to a player will draw you a card. The same combo can also be achieved with Tandem Lookout, a 2/1 human scout with Soul Bond, and, as long as it's paired with another creature, both creatures have, whenever this creature deals damage to an opponent, draw a card. Again, once you start the loop, you're off to the races. In short, as long as Niv is enchanted by Curiosity or paired with Tandem Lookout, you win the game if your total opponent's life is less than the number of cards you can draw. Otherwise, this combo will make you draw your entire deck and deal damage to your opponents equal to the number of cards you draw. And the best part is that you can stop this combo at any time by simply choosing not to draw a card with Curiosity, or simply dealing the Niv-Mizzet damage to a creature or something. So just by looking at our commander, there's one major problem with him, namely his mana cost. 3 blue and 3 red mana can be pretty tricky to get consistently, especially since we're on a budget and don't have good access to regular dual lands. So let's go through our mana ramp and mana rocks. First, we gotta put an old reliable Arcane Signet and our Izzet Signet to make sure we get our colored mana available. Similarly, we're going to be putting in the Izzet Locket and Commander Sphere, not only to provide us with more mana, but to also give us an option to draw some cards if we need. I also threw in a Talisman of Creativity to give us a blue or a red mana at the cost of 1 damage, and a Felwar Stone since somebody in the pod is bound to play the same color as us. I'm also adding in a Thought Vessel. Even though it doesn't provide any colored mana, the no maximum hand size clause is way too good to pass up since we plan on drawing a bunch of cards and want to hold on to all of our options. Another good budget option is Midnight Clock. It's a 3 mana rock that can tap for a blue, and at the beginning of each upkeep, or if you pay 3 mana, you can put an hour counter on it. Then when the clock strikes 12, you time twist yourself, shuffling your hand and graveyard into your deck, and drawing a brand new 7. I also want to try and squeak 1 more mana rock in this deck, so 1 copy of Sky Diamond should be enough to make sure that we get our ramp. We're also playing a copy of Wayfarer's Bauble, a good budget option to make sure we get the land that we need. And then lastly, we're going to include probably the best mana producer in the entire deck, Stormkiln Artist. For 4 mana, you get a 2/2 Dwarf Shaman that gets +1/+0 for each artifact you control, but the real kicker is its Magecraft ability. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, create a treasure token. This one ability can single-handedly net you enough mana to make every one of your turns explosive. Just cast some simple cantrip spells, and you'll be drawing like a maniac in no time. But what card draw spells are we actually running? Since our commander deals damage every time we draw a card, we want to be drawing cards as much as possible. And being in red and blue, our options are pretty good. But since our commander wants us to cast a bunch of instants and sorceries, we're not running too many creatures that draw us cards. One of the best creatures we are running is Body of Knowledge. It's a 5-mana avatar with its power and toughness defined as the number of cards in your hand, and it also gives you the no maximum hand size clause, and whenever it's dealt damage, you draw that many cards. This card can be pretty good and can deter your opponents from attacking you or blocking when you attack with it. It can also start another near infinite loop with your commander, as you can deal the 1 damage to the Body of Knowledge, draw a card, and then get another trigger to deal more damage to it. Drawing out your entire library this way is fun, but it can't win the game by itself unless you have another way to deal damage on the battlefield. Fortunately, we're also playing the original Niv-Mizzet the Firemind. This iteration of Niv is like our commander, as it also has the whenever you draw a card deal a damage text, but it replaces its other abilities with the ability to tap to draw a card. Having your commander, Body of Knowledge, and the Firemind on the battlefield at the same time yields the same effect as the Curiosity or Tandem Lookout combo as before. When you draw a card, your 2 Nivs will trigger, and you can deal 1 damage to an opponent, and 1 damage to the Body of Knowledge. Triggering the Body of Knowledge, draw another card. Niv-Mizzet the Firemind is also a valid target for the Curiosity or Tandem Lookout combo if you can't get your commander out as efficiently. The other budget creature we're running that draws us a card is Crackling Drake. It's a pretty underwhelming card since it only draws us a card on ETB, however having its power defined as the number of instants and sorceries in your graveyard and in exile can make this thing a huge flying beater in the mid to late game. Our commander also lets us draw an additional card whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell, so all of our cantrip effects get supercharged. But an important thing to remember when playing this deck is that we will draw a card off the Niv-Mizzet trigger before resolving the spell. For example, when we cast Consider, we'll draw a card off the Niv-Mizzet first, then Surveil 1 and draw off the spell. Our Frantic Search does a lot here by letting us draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards, then untap 3 lands, effectively refunding us the mana we put into casting it. Opt is like Consider, letting us scry 1 instead of surveilling, while Quick Study here is an instant speed divination that simply draws us 2 cards. For our red card draw, we're playing our copies of Demand Answers and Thrill of Possibility. For the small price of discarding a card or sacrificing an artifact in the case of Demand Answers, we get to draw 2 cards at instant speed. Another card I like including in this list is Izzet Charm. Not only is it flavorful in this deck, but it's also an extremely cheap and versatile spell. I decided to include it in the card draw section of this deck since I believe that'll be the mode chosen the most often. However, being able to mana spike a non-creature spell or dealing 2 damage to a creature is too good to pass up, and it can be great removal in case of an emergency. Similarly, Prismari Command here is included for the same reasons. The mode to draw 2 and discard 2 is the mode you'll probably choose the most, but the other options to do 2 damage to something, refund a mana back with a treasure token, or simply removing an artifact is good flexibility that shouldn't be overlooked. And the last instant speed card draw effect isn't really a card draw per se, but Dig Through Time is an excellent card selection spell. Being able to choose 2 cards out of your top 7 is an amazing effect to have, and the chance to only pay 2 mana for it makes this card so unbelievably broken. There's a reason why this card is banned in Modern and Legacy. But not all of our card draw effects are instant speed. After all, our commander triggers whenever we cast an instant or a sorcery, so what sorcery speed effects do we run? Our first one is Clear the Mind. It allows us to shuffle a graveyard into their library and have us draw a card. Not only does this effect let us recycle our graveyard back into our deck in an emergency, but it can also shuffle another player's pesky graveyard and mess up their strategy to make them start at square one. We're also playing Preordain to scry 2, then draw a card, and Serum Visions, which does the opposite, drawing a card and then scrying 2. We also gotta include Treasure Cruise, another delve spell that's also banned in Modern and Legacy because of the potential of drawing 3 cards at the cost of just 1 blue mana is simply too good. Our only sorcery speed mono red card draw spell is Faithless Looting, a 1 mana draw 2 discard 2 that you can cast again with flashback. This next one, again, doesn't draw any cards per se, but Expressive Iteration gives great card selection for just 2 mana. Another interesting include I decided to put in is Firemind's Research. This flavorful enchantment gets a charge counter every time you cast an instant or sorcery spell, and you can pay a blue, a generic, and remove 2 charge counters from it to draw a card. So this little enchantment can passively build charge until you're ready to cash it in by paying a little bit of mana. You can also pay a generic, a red, and remove 5 charge counters to deal 5 damage to anything. It's a good, flexible way to either draw cards or remove a problematic threat. And lastly, you love her, you hate her, it's Narset Parter Avails. Now we're not really primed to take advantage of her static ability, preventing your opponents from drawing more than 1 card per turn, but that's just an upside that can take some heat away from you and more towards her. We're mainly using Narset here for the card selection of her -2 ability. Most of our deck are non-creature, non-land cards, so finding something useful to cast with her should be a breeze. Now with all the instants and sorceries in the deck, we really should capitalize on the pure number of spells we're going to cast. So this section is dedicated to cards that give us extra triggers whenever we cast one. Our first one is Erebor Flamesmith from the Lord of the Rings. It's a 2-mana 2/1 Dwarf Artificer that deals 1 damage to each opponent whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell. This type of effect is good here, as it is more redundancy with our commander. Similarly, Gutter Snipe does the same thing but deals 2 damage instead of 1, which really accelerates our game plan. We're also including a copy of Kessig Flamebreather from Crimson Vow for more of this incidental damage, but this creature not only triggers whenever we cast an instant or sorcery, but any non-creature spell we cast. Thermo Alchemist can tap to deal 1 damage to each opponent, and whenever we cast an instant or sorcery, we get to untap them so we can tap them again. And one of my favorite cards that we're including here is a copy of Psychosis Crawler. For 5 mana, we get an artifact creature Phyrexian Horror, whose power and toughness are equal to the number of cards in your hand, similar to Body of Knowledge. However, unlike Body of Knowledge, the Psychosis Crawler has each opponent lose a life whenever we draw a card. Now, losing a life is different than dealing 1 damage, so we gotta be careful with any effects that care about dealing damage. But having a potentially large creature that you can cast with any color of mana that drains your opponent's life is too good. The last piece of burn we're going to talk about is a card I wasn't even aware of until doing research for this deck, and that's Fiery Inscription from the Lord of the Rings. It's a 3-mana enchantment that has the Ring Tempt you whenever it enters the battlefield, but the important part is that it has the Gutter Snipe text of dealing 2 damage to each opponent whenever you cast an instant or sorcery. We really want to try and double down on dealing damage to our opponents in this deck, and the burn package here should be enough to get us reliably to do that. But dealing direct damage to our opponents isn't the only way we can win the game. We also play several effects that create an army of tokens when we cast our spells. Murmuring Mystic is one of those spells. For 4 mana, we get a 1/5 human wizard that makes a 1/1 flying bird creature token every time we cast an instant or sorcery. The same thing with Talrand Sky Summoner, however the tokens he makes are beefy 2/2 drakes. We're also playing a copy of the Third Path Iconoclast to make some 1/1 artifact soldiers, and of course the classic Young Pyromancer to get those sweet, sweet elementals. With all these instants and sorceries, it can get pretty mana intensive pretty quickly. So I've included some mana reducers to have it so we can cast as many things as we can. Playing cards like Mocking Sprite and Goblin Electromancer are key in this deck. Having all of our spells cost 1 less can make for some pretty explosive turns. One special include I put into this deck is a copy of the Case of the Ransacked Lab from Murders at Karlov Manor. Its static ability gives us some mana reduction for our spells, and if we solve the case by casting 4 more spells in a turn, i.e. playing our deck, we get the added bonus of having an extra instance of one of our commander's abilities to draw us more cards. Alright, now that we're done with our spell reducers, let's move on to the removal section of our deck. We want to make sure that we have some interaction here, and blue-red is an excellent color combination for just that. Of course, all of our removal is instant and sorcery based, just to make sure that we can trigger our commander as much as possible. First off is Reality Shift, a fun little 2-drop spell that can exile a threat and turn it into a less threatening 2/2. Sure, they can turn the manifested creature face up at any time for its mana cost, however, you're more likely to hit one of their land drops or a key non-creature spell that'll remain locked on the battlefield until they can kill it. And if they do manifest a creature, any cast or ETB triggers that it had will be turned off. Snap is also a fun spell in this deck. Pay 2 to bounce a creature back to its controller's hand, and then refund you back the lands used to play it. Snap actually has a dual purpose in this deck, not only to bounce your opponent's stuff, but to also save your commander in the event of a board wipe, or it being targeted by a removal spell that would end up putting it back in your command zone. Abrade is a nice budget inclusion in this deck, giving you the option to either deal 3 damage to a creature or just outright destroying an artifact, and Chain Reaction is one of our main budget board wipes in the deck, dealing damage equal to the number of creatures on the field. We also gotta put in a copy of Chaos Warp, an excellent spot removal spell played in almost every single red deck. And I'm personally excited to play Grapeshot in this deck. I mean, come on, it's Grapeshot. What more do you want from me? Our secondary board wipe in the deck is another personal favorite, Mizium Mortars. For 2 mana, you can deal 4 damage to something, but if you pay its overload cost, you get 4 damage to everything you don't control. I did a whole video about all of the Izzet guild mechanics, including Overload earlier this year, so if you're interested in learning more about this mechanic and how it works, go ahead and check out the iCard or the link in the description for the playlist for my Rules, Keywords, and Mechanics series. Our last budget removal spell includes a copy of Gandalf's Sanction.
For a generic, a blue and a red, it deals damage equal to the number of instant and sorcery cards in your graveyards to a creature, and any excess damage gets trampled over to its controller. I mean, you've seen the sheer mass of spells we play in this deck, so having X come out to be an outrageous number is an easy feat. It can also surprise kill an opponent if they're low enough to do so. Now before I move on to our next section, I just want to touch on some spells we're playing to try and get more spell out of our spells. Well, what I mean are some copy effects that we can use on any of our draw spells or removal spells. Expansion Explosion is good at this. Now, I cover split cards like this more in detail in my Ravnica Remastered Rules, Keywords, and Mechanics video that you can find in the iCard or in the link in the description, but basically you can cast either half of this card. If you cast Expansion, you can copy an instant or sorcery spell with mana value 4 or less, essentially doubling all the effects you would get from the spell. Alternatively, if you cast Explosion, you can deal some good damage to something and draw some cards in the process. Explosion is at least 5 mana to deal a damage and draw a card, so unless you have a large mana pool, Expansion is probably the spell you're going to cast the most often. Speaking of copying spells, Swarm Intelligence is a big dumb enchantment that doubles all our instant and sorcery spells as long as it sticks. Doubling all of our draw effects and removal spells is an invaluable tool that we can and should take advantage of. The last budget card I want to talk about is Mystic Retrieval. Even though it's not the most exciting spell to cast, paying for it to get back a useful spell, and then flashing it back for additional value is a good asset in our toolbox. Our final category before getting into our lands is our counterspell package. We're in blue, and counterspells are a great way to ensure that our commander gets to stick around to do what he needs to do. Dispel is a neat and efficient counterspell that counters an instant spell. It's restrictive in that aspect, but a lot of things that can interact with our commander are going to be instants anyway. The same can be said about Muddle the Mixture, only being able to counter an instant or a sorcery spell. But this counterspell has the upside of being transmuted if it's otherwise a dead card in our hand. Now, we're not really primed to grab a powerful 2-drop as a budget deck, but we can still grab a Mana Rock or one of our bird pieces with the ability. Negate is a decent include to counter any non-creature spell too. Rewind is a powerful counterspell in this deck, as it refunds you back the 4 lands used to cast it, allowing you to cast more spells in the same turn as needed. Spell Pierce is a good mana spike effect, and Unwind is similar to Rewind, refunding you back the lands, but only to counter a non-creature spell like Negate. Now, we are playing some fun multicolored counterspells in this deck too, like one of my favorites, Counterflux. Counterflux is an uncounterable counterspell that can be overloaded for 1 more generic mana. So if one of your opponents tries to combo off while putting so many spells on the stack, just pay the overload cost and watch all those problems just go away. Our last counterspell is Ionize, which recently got reprinted in the Breaking News bonus sheet. It's an elegant 3 mana counterspell that shocks the countered spell's controller for 2 damage. And finally, we get to talk about our lands. And even though this is a budget deck, there are a bunch of dual lands we can play just to make sure that we get our necessary mana when we need it. Our first includes, of course, Command Tower and Exotic Orchard. Ferris Lake is a good cheap filter land, and Frostbarrel Snarl can provide access to either mana we need if we have an island or mountain in our hand. Now, we are playing several lands that enter the battlefield tapped, like our Izzet Boilerworks, Izzet Guildgate, and Molten Tributary. Even though they do enter tapped, they provide a valuable resource to our deck that our budget allows. Along these same lines, Restless Spire is a neat little creature land that can be activated to make it become a 2/1 elemental that has first strike on your turn and allows you to scry 1 on attack. Shivan Reef is a great land here that provides colorless mana, but can give you either of our colors at the small price of 1 life. And Sulphur Falls can come in untapped if we already control an island or mountain. And of course, Swiftwater Cliffs is a good budget option that gives you an extra life, just in case. The last dual land we play is a copy of Temple of Epiphany, which lets us scry 1 when it enters. Now, even though it's the last of our dual lands, we still play a few non-basic lands to help us in some way. One of these cards is Mystic Sanctuary. When the Sanctuary enters, if you control 3 other islands, it not only enters untapped, but it'll put an instant or sorcery card back on top of your deck for you to use again. Having this land get back your cantrips or removal is an excellent tool in our arsenal. The last of our non-basics are dedicated to getting our basic lands when we need them. Cards like Evolving Wilds, Myriad Landscape, and Terramorphic Expanse are not only cheap, but makes our basic lands more available to us to reliably cast our spells. Then, we round out our remaining lands with 9 islands and 9 mountains, and there you have it, our finished and complete budget commander deck. As you can see, we can successfully make a fully fledged commander deck for just about $50. This Izzet Spellslinger deck is a perfect casual commander that you can bring to your own local game night with friends for around the same price as a precon. But after playing this deck for a while, you might start to look for some cheap potential upgrades. Well, I can help with that too. Let's increase the budget of this deck from $50 to $100 and see what kind of swaps we can make. Fortunately, with our extra $50, we're able to make 26 total swaps from the original deck list to increase the power level a touch. And I actually quite like the fact that we're able to swap out a good chunk of this deck. Unlike other upgrade guides, we don't need to hope and pray to get our upgrade pieces. Just by swapping out about a quarter of our deck will drastically increase the likelihood of us playing them. So without further ado, let's take a look at our creature swaps first. The first swap I want to make is Body of Knowledge for Archmage Emeritus. It probably seems strange that we're swapping out a potential combo piece, but hear me out. The Body of Knowledge is a pretty big mana sink for not that much immediate value. It's 5 mana, which is a lot, and it doesn't do anything when it enters other than giving you no maximum hand size. Also, unless you can reliably deal damage to it yourself, you're most likely not going to draw as many cards as you'd want, since your opponents are incentivized not to attack into it or block it. Instead, I'd rather play the Archmage. It's 1 less mana, you're more likely to draw cards off of it by casting or copying your spells, and it synergizes with our already established game plan. Next is switching out Cackling Drake for O'Hare Pot-Patique Deepest Epic, swapping out an underwhelming card with a really interesting inclusion. This O'Hare gives the instant spells we cast from our hand rebound, letting us cast them again for free in our upkeep. And unless our opponents play any exile removal, this thing is difficult to get rid of, as when it dies, it transforms into a land that can bring it back out. Next is swapping out Kessig Flame Breather for a Harmonic Prodigy, sacrificing a little bit of burn to make it so that our Shaman or Wizard triggers are doubled. Niv is a wizard, Talrand is a wizard, Guttersnipe is a shaman. It's not difficult to see that putting in a Harmonic Prodigy here is beneficial to what we want to do. Our next swap is Mocking Sprite for Baral Chief of Compliance. They both do the same thing, but Baral does more, and at a cheaper mana cost. Whenever we counter a spell, we get the opportunity to draw, then discard a card. Our next swap is Murmuring Mystic for Torbrand, Thane of Redfell. Torbrand does a lot for our burn package here, allowing us to deal an additional 2 damage with all of our red sources. This little swap can make our incidental damage dealers a big issue. Our last creature swap is our Thermo Alchemist for an Electrostatic Field. Now I have thought about keeping both creatures in the deck, but I decided to stick with just a simple swap for the other. Don't get me wrong, Thermo Alchemist is great in this deck, but you must wait a whole turn cycle to be able to do any damage with it. For the same mana cost, Electrostatic Field can deal damage to your opponents the same turn it comes down. Plus, it has an additional point of toughness, which can actually make a decent blocker for a majority of creatures. But that's all our creature swaps, so let's move on to our instant spells. These swaps are mainly going to affect our counterspell package, finding better replacements and swapping in for more interaction. The first swap is Counterflux for an Arcane Denial. Now, I do have a soft spot for Counterflux, I do, but I must admit that it's not the best. Needing to have 2 blue and a red available to counter a spell is pretty restrictive. I'd much rather have a more reliable counter spell, and Arcane Denial does just that but more. On the next upkeep after you counter the spell, that spell's controller gets to draw a card, but you get to draw 2 cards, which feeds into our deck's theme. Similarly, we're going to be swapping out Ionize for just simple, plain, and classic counterspell. Next, we're going to be taking out some counterspells in favor of more interaction. We're going to be swapping Muddle the Mixture for Brainstorm. A real quick instant speed draw 3 is good, and the card selection to put 2 cards from our hand on top should not be ignored if we can shuffle them back somehow. We're also going to swap out Spell Pierce for a Rapid Hybridization and an Unwind for Lightning Bolt, making sure we can interact with our opponent's stuff for cheap. Now let's swap for some better board wipes. We're going to take out Chain Reaction in favor of Blasphemous Act. Chain Reaction is still good, but being able to wipe the board for just 1 red is insane value. We're also swapping Mizzy Mortars for a different kind of board wipe, Vandal Blast. This board wipe still has Overload, but instead of hitting our opponent's creatures, it hits all of their artifacts. Also, we're taking out Gandalf Sanction for a Mana Geyser, so we can have a 1-turn explosion of red mana. Some other spells we're taking out are our copy of Grapeshot for Ponder, our Clear the Mind for a Windfall, and our Mystic Retrieval for a Gitaxian Probe. Just some clear and simple swaps for more card advantage. We're also making some swaps in our artifact slot too. First is a Mana Rock swap of Midnight Clock for the Decanter of Endless Water. The decanter can make either a red or blue mana, and instead of messing around with our counters and waiting around until it does something, it simply gives you no maximum hand size, a more useful ability in the early game. We're also taking out a Sky Diamond for a copy of Swiftfoot Boots, not only to give our commander haste, but to make sure that he can stick around for a while longer with Hexproof. And the last swap is Wayfarer's Bauble for a copy of Sol Ring. I was surprised that I couldn't include Sol Ring in the $50 build, but here it is now. Our final swaps here are going to be a couple of our enchantments and some of our lands. First is a pretty fun swap of Firemind's Research for a Teferi's Ageless Insight. So whenever we draw a card that isn't the first one we draw on our draw steps, we draw 2 cards instead. This little enchantment supercharges all of our draw effects and quickly accelerates us on our game plan. The other enchantment we're swapping in is Swarm Intelligence for a 1000-Year Storm. This spell also copies our instants and sorceries, but does so for each time we've already cast one in the same turn. And at 1 less mana value compared to Swarm Intelligence, it's an easy swap to make our deck more efficient. And lastly, we got our lands, swapping out a Molten Tributary for a Stormcarved Coast, Restless Spire for a Cascade Bluffs, Myriad Landscape for a Fiery Islet, and our Terramorphic Expanse for a Reliquary Tower for another sweet instance of no maximum hand size. So we've gone over the $50 budget list, and we've gone over the $100 budget list, but what if money really isn't an issue and I just want to drop some cash on some cardboard? Well, now's the time to get into my top 10 list of budget list cards to include to ramp up this deck's power to 11. But first, some honorable mentions. My first honorable mention is Ophidian Eye, another enchantment aura. In the same vein as the Curiosity or a Tandem Lookout, Ophidian Eye also starts the Infinite Loop, but with the bonus of it being able to be flashed out, so you can cast it on your opponent's turns to combo off as soon as you're able. However, the current price tag of this card is a little bit too high to include it in our budget lists, and we already have other combo pieces, so I decided not to force this card in. But if you can pick up a copy, you won't be disappointed. Laboratory Maniac is my other honorable mention. If for whatever reason we can't win the game by dealing damage, Labman makes it that as long as we can draw out, we still win. I imagine that this deck can get low on cards, especially if we have all our engines on all cylinders, so adding in a copy of Laboratory Maniac is a great safety net. Coming in at number 10 is O'Hare Aishonil, Deepest Might. This legendary god really amplifies our burn package. If a red source you control deals an amount of non-combat damage to lessen its power to an opponent, that damage becomes equal to its power instead. So this creature makes all of your Niv damage triggers, or Gutter Snipe triggers, absurd. Plus, it's just as difficult to kill as O'Hare Papatique, transforming into a land that you can retransform back. If you can pick up this one, I highly recommend it. Number 9 is the cheap counterspell, Swan Song. And I mean cheap by its mana value, cause man, I remember when this card was like $1 when it was first printed. But I get it, it hasn't been reprinted as much, and it's pretty in demand. For 1 mana, you can counter target instant, sorcery, or enchantment spell, and in exchange, that spell's controller makes a 2/2 flying bird. Now giving your opponent a creature isn't the best, but being able to counter a more significant spell can wind up saving your life in the long run. Plus, our commander flies, and we have other cards that can block the flyer if you are truly concerned about it. Swansong, very good. Our number 8 card is a little underwhelming because it's Steam Vents. Now, I recognize that having a land on this top 10 list isn't exciting for a lot of people, but in this deck especially, we need to ensure that we have access to all of our mana and all of our colors as soon as we can, and Steam Vents can give us access to that at a simple cost of 2 life. It also counts as an island and a mountain, so our effects from cards like Mystic Sanctuary can see that. Coming right off of our number 8, number 7 is another land, Scalding Tarn. For the same reason as Steam Vents, Scalding Tarn can ensure that our mana is as good as possible at the low cost of just paying 1 life. Again, not very exciting, but I feel like in this deck, it is a necessity. Coming in at number 6 is Deflecting Swat. Even though this card was reprinted last year in Commander Masters, it still has a high price tag. For 3 mana, you get to choose new targets for a target spell or ability, but the real power from this card is that if you control a commander, you can cast the spell without paying its mana cost. Our commander has a high mana cost, and paying that much just to have it removed by an opponent is exhausting. This little card can make it so that when you have Niv out, you can protect him while also redirecting whatever was coming at him to something else. A very powerful inclusion. Number 5 is a card that got reprinted recently in the Breaking News bonus sheet of Outlaws of Thunder Junction. Mana Drain is a low-cost counterspell that packs a major punch. At the beginning of your next main phase, you add an amount of colorless mana equal to the countered spell's mana value. Even though colorless mana doesn't help us to cast our commander outside of commander attacks, having access to this bonus mana makes it such that we can cast as many of our other spells as we can. And since this card was reprinted just last month, there are bound to be copies floating around, so picking one up shouldn't be too much of an issue if you really want to drop some cash. Coming in at number 4 is a copy of Cyclonic Rift, another card that was reprinted earlier this year. However, not even the reprint could bring down the outrageous price tag on this card. But I do have to say, this card is simply excellent. At instant speed, you can pay 2 mana to bounce a non-land permanent back to their hands, or overload it for 7 for a massive one-sided board wipe. This on-flavor removal spell fits neatly into our removal package, and will completely blow out your opponents and make them start from scratch while you get the upper hand. My third top card that I would like to try to put in if we had the cash is a copy of Rhystic Study. If you've ever played with or against someone with a Rhystic Study, you know exactly how powerful and annoying this card can be. For just 1 mana, you get an enchantment with, whenever an opponent casts a spell, you may draw a card unless that player pays 1 generic mana. Rhystic Study is a perfect inclusion in this deck because it can make our opponents think twice about which spells they want to cast to make sure they can pay their taxes. Otherwise, they will be actively playing into our game plan, drawing you more cards and getting you closer to a swift victory. The runner-up on our list is like our number 6 pick, but it's likely to be more useful. My number 2 pick is a copy of Fierce Guardianship. At first glance, it just looks like a worse negate. However, it has the Deflecting SWAT text, allowing us to cast this counterspell for free if we control a commander. Like the Deflecting SWAT argument, once we already have our commander on board, we want to make sure that we can protect him at all costs, and Fierce Guardianship is a way we can do that without needing to spend any mana. Plus, it's a nice card to bluff. Your opponents will not be expecting a Fierce Guardianship when you're completely tapped out. Not completely worth the high price tag in my opinion, but if you got the cash burning in your pocket, it's an excellent choice. And lastly, our number 1 card to include in a truly budgetless deck is Jeweled Lotus. Now I know, this card is outrageously expensive. This singular card is worth more than both of our budgets, which is completely insane. But what this card does is extremely impactful. At the cost of 0 mana, you get an artifact that you can tap and sacrifice to add 3 mana of any one color, but only to cast your commander. I fully understand that this card can be put into literally any commander deck and be good, but a Jeweled Lotus in this deck can get absurd. Remember, our commander requires specifically 6 colored mana, so if we can produce 3 mana of one color, this 1 mana rock can make the other 3. And if we manage to get the Jeweled Lotus in our opening hand, we can bring out Niv-Mizzet as early as turn 2 or 3, and having our commander out that early puts a lot of pressure on our opponents. Jeweled Lotus is an amazing inclusion, but with an insane price tag. If your playgroup doesn't mind you proxying this card, it's definitely worth trying it out before dropping so much cash. And that's all I got for you today. I really hope you enjoyed this video and my analysis of this deck. This video took a long time to make, and I'm very happy to have made it and to be able to share it with you all. Since you made it this far, I'd really appreciate it if you'd like and share this video, and maybe even check out some of my other stuff. And if you like what I do, go ahead and click that subscribe button to help me and the channel out. But now I turn it over to you guys. Do you guys like this deck and plan on making it yourself? Is there something you don't like about this deck? Or maybe you just want to share some spicy tech that you play in your own Niv-Mizzet deck? Let me know in the comments below. This was Jared on TMMTG, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!